picture, if you will. A world where fashion dictated not just how one looked, but how one moved, sat, and even attended to the most basic human needs. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was a time of extraordinary social change, industrial advancement, and rigid social conventions. Yet beneath the elegant silhouettes and refined mannerisms lay practical challenges that modern women can barely imagine. The streets of London in the 1860s bustled with women whose silhouettes defied the natural human form. Enormous bell-shaped skirts swayed gracefully as they walked, creating an almost ethereal presence that seemed to float rather than stride. These magnificent garments, supported by intricate frameworks of steel hoops and whalebone, represented the pinnacle of feminine fashion. Yet they also presented daily obstacles that required ingenuity, planning, and no small amount of patience to overcome. Victorian dress was not merely clothing, it was architecture worn on the body. The process of dressing each morning was a carefully choreographed ritual that could take well over an hour with the assistance of a lady's maid. First came the chemise, a thin cotton undergarment that served as the foundation layer. Over this, a corset was laced tightly, designed to create the desired wasp waist that defined feminine beauty of the era. The corset, contrary to popular belief, was not typically laced to dangerous extremes by most women, though it did provide significant support and shaping. The crinoline, that marvel of Victorian engineering, came next. In the 1850s and 1860s, these cage-like structures could extend up to 6 feet in diameter at their base. Made initially of horsehair and cotton, they evolved to incorporate steel hoops that were lighter yet more durable. The crinoline revolutionized women's fashion by eliminating the need for multiple heavy petticoats. But it created its own unique set of challenges in daily life. Imagine the simple act of sitting down while wearing such a contraption. Victorian ladies developed a specific technique, approaching chairs carefully and allowing the back hoops to flip up while the front portion compressed. The skilled Victorian woman could execute this maneuver with grace and apparent effortlessness, though it required considerable practice to master. Public seating was often designed with wider seats to accommodate these fashionable dimensions. The question of personal hygiene and bodily functions in such elaborate dress was one that Victorian society addressed with characteristic ingenuity and discretion. The very nature of these voluminous skirts, while presenting challenges, also offered certain advantages in terms of privacy and concealment. The layers of fabric created a natural screen, and the wide circumference meant that chamber pots could be positioned underneath without detection. In the privacy of their own homes, wealthy Victorian women had access to elegantly appointed water closets, or dressing rooms, equipped with chamber pots concealed within specially designed commodes. These pieces of furniture were often beautifully crafted, with mahogany or walnut exteriors that matched the bedroom decor. The chamber pot itself might be made of fine porcelain, sometimes decorated with delicate floral patterns that belied its practical purpose. The positioning required for using such facilities while fully dressed was a skill learned from childhood. Young girls practiced the art of managing their skirts with modesty and efficiency. The key was to lift the front layers while allowing the back to cascade naturally, creating a tent-like enclosure. The numerous petticoats and the crinoline structure actually facilitated this process, as the framework could be tilted and compressed to allow access while maintaining privacy. For middle-class and working-class women, the solutions were often more practical, but required equal ingenuity. Shared outdoor privies were common in urban areas, and these were typically constructed with wider seats and higher walls to accommodate women's fashion. The approach to using such facilities required careful planning and timing, as the process was necessarily more time-consuming than it would be for men or for women in simpler dress. Public occasions presented particular challenges. At lengthy church services, elaborate dinner parties, or extended social calls, Victorian women had to plan accordingly. The concept of the retiring room became essential in polite society. Hostesses provided specially designated spaces where ladies could attend to personal needs and make adjustments to their attire with the assistance of their maids or female servants. The Victorian woman's reticule, or handbag, often contained small bottles of smelling salts, cologne water, and delicate handkerchiefs. These items served multiple purposes, including masking any unpleasant odors that might arise from limited washing facilities or the challenges of maintaining perfect hygiene while wearing such restrictive clothing. The language of fans also played a role in discreet communication, with specific gestures indicating when a lady needed to excuse herself from company. Travel presented its own unique set of challenges. Railway carriages were gradually modified to include ladies' retiring rooms, though these were often cramped and poorly ventilated. The gentle rocking motion of the train, combined with the constraints of fashionable dress, required careful balance and timing. Many Victorian women preferred to limit their fluid intake before long journeys, a practice that, while practical, could lead to other health complications. The development of specialized undergarments reflected the practical needs of women navigating these challenges. Drawers, or pantalettes as they were sometimes called, became increasingly common throughout the Victorian period. These garments, initially considered rather risque, eventually became accepted as necessary for modesty and hygiene. They were typically made of fine cotton or linen and featured open seams for practical purposes. The wealthy employed ladies' maids who were skilled in the intricate process of helping their mistresses dress and undress. These servants understood the mechanics of each garment and could assist with the delicate maneuvering required for personal care. The relationship between a lady and her maid often involved a level of intimacy and trust that modern people might find surprising, as the maid was privy to the most personal aspects of her mistress's daily routine. In grand country houses, the architecture itself was designed with these practical considerations in mind. Ladies' suites included spacious dressing rooms with adequate space for maneuvering and full dress, and water closets were positioned conveniently near bedrooms. The servants' quarters included facilities for cleaning and maintaining the complex undergarments, and managing the practical aspects of laundry that such elaborate dress required. The evolution of plumbing during the Victorian era gradually improved conditions for those who could afford it. The development of the flush toilet, though invented earlier, became more widespread during this period. However, the installation of such modern conveniences was expensive and often limited to the most prosperous households. Many families continued to rely on traditional methods well into the later decades of the century. The seasonal nature of Victorian social life meant that women often had to adapt their strategies based on the climate and social calendar. Summer brought additional challenges, as the layers of clothing and restrictive undergarments could be stifling in warm weather. The London season required extensive planning, as ladies would attend multiple events daily, each requiring careful consideration of practical needs alongside social obligations. Winter presented its own difficulty. Cold, drafty houses meant that outdoor facilities could be particularly unpleasant. The wealthy might have indoor facilities, but these were often poorly heated. Chamber pots were sometimes warmed before use, and heavy nightgowns and robes were essential for nighttime visits to indoor water closets. The risk of catching cold during these necessary excursions was a genuine concern in an era when medical understanding of illness was still limited. The social etiquette surrounding these necessary functions was elaborate and carefully codified. Ladies never spoke directly of such matters in mixed company, and euphemisms abounded in polite conversation. The phrase "powder my nose" or "take some air" might indicate a need to retire temporarily. Hostesses were expected to anticipate their guests' needs without direct communication, and the provision of adequate facilities was considered a mark of good breeding and proper household management. Medical professionals of the era began to recognize the health implications of restrictive clothing and the challenges it presented. Some progressive doctors advocated for dress reform, arguing that the constraints of fashionable attire contributed to various ailments. The tight lacing of corsets was blamed for digestive problems, and the weight and bulk of skirts were thought to contribute to fatigue and back problems. However, these medical opinions often conflicted with social expectations and were slow to influence mainstream fashion. The role of clothing in defining social status meant that even women who might have preferred more practical attire felt compelled to conform to fashionable standards. The ability to wear such elaborate dress was itself a symbol of leisure and prosperity, as it clearly indicated that the wearer did not need to engage in physical labor. This created a situation where practicality was often sacrificed for the sake of social signaling. Children growing up in Victorian households learned these skills from an early age. Young girls practiced managing their clothing with grace and efficiency, and mothers considered it an essential part of their daughters' education. The transition from the simpler dress of childhood to the complex attire of adulthood was gradual, with increasingly elaborate garments introduced as girls matured. This progressive training ensured that by the time they reached society, young women could navigate these challenges with apparent ease. The servants' perspective on these challenges was rarely recorded, but it's clear that they bore much of the practical burden of maintaining the complex lifestyle that fashionable dress required. Ladies' maids developed specialized knowledge and skills, and their expertise was highly valued. The laundering, pressing, and maintenance of such elaborate garments required considerable time and effort, and the personal assistance needed for dressing and undressing was a significant part of their daily duties. Regional variations in fashion and lifestyle created different approaches to these common challenges. Rural Victorian women might have more privacy and fewer social constraints, allowing for more practical solutions. Urban ladies faced greater scrutiny and had access to more elaborate facilities, but also dealt with more crowded conditions and less privacy. The differences between English, American, and continental European approaches to these matters reflected broader cultural attitudes toward modesty, privacy, and social convention. The development of department stores and ready-made clothing during the latter part of the Victorian era began to democratize fashion to some extent. However, the most elaborate styles remained the province of the wealthy, as they required custom fitting and considerable maintenance. The emergence of fashion magazines helped spread information about proper dress and deportment, including subtle guidance on managing the practical aspects of fashionable attire. Public health concerns gradually began to influence attitudes toward dress and hygiene. The growing understanding of disease transmission led to increased emphasis on cleanliness and proper sanitation. This created some tension with fashionable dress, as elaborate garments were difficult to clean thoroughly, and frequent washing could damage delicate fabrics and trimmings. The psychological aspects of managing these daily challenges should not be underestimated. Victorian women developed remarkable patience and planning skills out of necessity. The ability to maintain composure and grace, while dealing with significant physical constraints, was considered a mark of true refinement. This mental discipline became part of the Victorian feminine ideal, alongside physical beauty and moral virtue. As the Victorian era progressed, subtle changes in fashion began to address some of these practical concerns. The bustle, which replaced the crinoline in the 1870s, was more manageable in many situations while still providing the fashionable silhouette. The development of more sophisticated undergarments and improvements in fabric technology gradually made fashionable dress somewhat less cumbersome, though it remained elaborate by modern standards. The evening routines of Victorian ladies involved careful planning for nighttime needs. Chamber pots were standard bedroom furniture, and the ritual of preparing for bed included ensuring that necessary facilities were within reach. The heavy nightgowns and robes worn during this period provided both warmth and modesty for any nighttime excursions that might be required. Professional women, though few in number during the early Victorian period, faced particular challenges in adapting fashionable dress to their work requirements. Teachers, governesses, and shop girls had to maintain respectable appearances while dealing with the practical demands of their employment. This led to some modifications in dress that prioritized function while still conforming to social expectations of feminine appearance. The international exchange of fashion ideas during the Victorian period meant that women across different countries faced similar challenges, though local customs and climate influenced specific solutions. The basic constraints of fashionable dress were remarkably consistent across the Western world, creating a shared experience among women of similar social classes, regardless of their nationality. Medical corsets and specialized undergarments began to appear later in the Victorian period, designed to provide support while addressing some of the health concerns associated with tight lacing. However, these were often bulky and still required careful management. The tension between health, practicality, and fashion remained a constant theme throughout the era. The role of personal hygiene in Victorian society was complex and often misunderstood by later generations. While frequent bathing was not always practical or even considered healthy by contemporary standards, Victorian women developed elaborate routines for maintaining cleanliness within the constraints of their lifestyle. The use of perfumes, powders, and other cosmetic aids served both aesthetic and practical purposes in masking the inevitable consequences of limited washing facilities and restrictive clothing. Social reformers of the late Victorian period began to advocate for dress reform more actively, organizing exhibitions and publishing pamphlets that demonstrated more practical alternatives to fashionable attire. These efforts met with limited success during the Victorian era itself, but laid the groundwork for the more dramatic changes in women's fashion that would occur in the early 20th century. The decline of the most extreme Victorian fashion coincided with changing social roles for women and new understanding of health and hygiene. The emergence of the new woman ideal in the 1890s brought with it a gradual acceptance of more practical dress, though the transition was slow and met with considerable resistance from conservative elements of society. Looking back on the Victorian era from our modern perspective, it's easy to focus on the impracticality and discomfort of the fashions of the time. However, it's important to understand that Victorian women were not helpless victims of their clothing, but rather skilled adapters who developed ingenious solutions to the challenges their society's expectations created. Their daily navigation of these obstacles required intelligence, planning, and considerable physical skill. The legacy of Victorian attitudes toward dress, modesty, and propriety continued to influence women's lives well into the 20th century. Many of the psychological and social patterns established during this period persisted long after the fashions themselves had changed. The idea that women should suffer for beauty, that elaborate dress indicated respectability, and that certain bodily functions should be surrounded by secrecy and euphemism all had their roots in Victorian culture. The stories of individual Victorian women, gleaned from diaries and letters, reveal the human reality behind these fashion constraints. They wrote of the relief of removing their corsets at the end of the day, of the planning required for long carriage rides, and of the social embarrassments that could occur when the mechanics of dress and the demands of nature came into conflict. These personal accounts provide a more nuanced understanding of how women actually lived within these constraints. The technological innovations of the Victorian period, from improved transportation to better plumbing, gradually made life easier for those who could afford them. However, the benefits of these advances were unevenly distributed, and many women continued to face significant challenges in managing the practical aspects of daily life, while maintaining fashionable appearances. The cultural mythology that has grown up around the Victorian era often emphasizes either the romanticism of the period's fashion or its supposed prudishness and repression. The reality was far more complex, involving practical problem-solving, social negotiation, and individual adaptation to challenging circumstances. Victorian women were neither the helpless fashion victims nor the completely repressed figures that popular imagination sometimes makes them out to be. As we consider the daily realities faced by Victorian women, we can appreciate both their resilience and their ingenuity in adapting to the expectations of their time. Their experiences remind us that fashion and social conventions always exist in tension with practical human needs, and that every generation finds ways to navigate these challenges according to the resources and knowledge available to them. The gradual changes in women's fashion that occurred throughout the Victorian period reflected not only changing aesthetic preferences, but also evolving understanding of health, practicality, and women's roles in society. Each modification, however subtle, represented negotiations between competing demands of fashion, function, and social acceptability. The end of the Victorian era brought with it new challenges and new solutions, but the resourcefulness and adaptability that women had developed during this period served them well as they entered the more liberated fashions and expanded social roles of the 20th century. The skills they had learned in managing complex clothing and social expectations translated into broader capabilities for managing the complexities of modern life. In reflecting on this chapter of women's history, we can see how the seemingly simple question of managing bodily needs while wearing fashionable dress opens up broader themes about women's lives, social expectations, technological change, and human adaptability. The Victorian woman's daily routine, with all its challenges and constraints, tells us as much about the values and priorities of her society as any political or economic history might do. The quiet ingenuity with which millions of women navigated these daily challenges, developing skills and strategies that were passed down from mother to daughter and shared among friends, represents a largely unrecorded but vitally important aspect of social history. Their solutions, whether elegant or simply practical, reflect the human capacity for adaptation and the persistent nature of basic human needs in the face of social convention. As we conclude this gentle exploration of Victorian women's daily realities, we can appreciate the complexity of their lives and the remarkable way they balanced social expectations with practical necessity. Their experiences remind us that every age has its challenges, and that human ingenuity always finds ways to meet even the most basic needs, regardless of the constraints society may impose. In understanding their world, we gain insight not only into the past but also into the persistent human qualities of adaptation, resourcefulness, and quiet dignity in the face of daily challenges. The intimate details of these women's lives, often hidden beneath layers of propriety and social convention, reveal a world of quiet determination and practical wisdom. Each morning's elaborate dressing ritual was not merely about appearance, but about preparing for a day filled with calculated movements and careful planning. The Victorian lady understood her clothing as both armor and obstacle, protecting her social position while simultaneously constraining her physical freedom. Consider the afternoon tea ceremony, that quintessential Victorian social gathering. Ladies would arrive in their finest dress, their enormous skirts requiring careful navigation around delicate furniture and other guests. The hostess would have planned not only the menu and conversation, but also the logistics of seating arrangements and discreet access to retiring rooms. The gentle rustle of silk and the careful positioning of feet beneath voluminous skirts created a choreography of social interaction that modern observers can barely imagine. The seasonal wardrobe changes of Victorian women represented monumental undertakings that involved entire households. Spring cleaning included not only the house, but also the careful storage of winter garments and the preparation of lighter summer dress. The specialized knowledge required to maintain silk, velvet, wool, and delicate trimmings meant that clothing care was almost a science in itself. The transition from heavy winter petticoats to lighter summer versions required gradual adjustment, as the body needed time to adapt to different levels of support and restriction. Within the confines of their elaborate dress, Victorian women developed a sophisticated understanding of body language and nonverbal communication. A slight shift of posture, the angle of a fan, or the adjustment of gloves could convey messages that spoken words could not. This silent vocabulary included discreet signals for personal needs, allowing ladies to communicate with their hostesses or companions without breaching social protocols about discussing bodily functions. The architecture of Victorian homes evolved to accommodate the realities of women's dress and needs. Doorways were widened, hallways were designed with alcoves for managing wide skirts, and stairways included broader landing. The positioning of mirrors, seating, and water closets all reflected an understanding of the spatial requirements created by fashionable dress. Even the height of wash basins and the design of bedroom furniture took into account the challenges of maintaining hygiene while wearing restrictive clothing. The development of specialized servants' roles reflected the complexity of maintaining Victorian feminine lifestyle. Beyond the lady's maid, households employed seamstresses for repairs and alterations, laundresses with expertise in delicate fabrics, and chambermaids, who understood the discreet handling of personal items. The training of these servants represented a significant investment in maintaining the elaborate lifestyle that fashionable dress required. Medical professionals of the era gradually began documenting the physical effects of restrictive clothing, though their recommendations often conflicted with social expectations. Physicians noted increased rates of digestive problems, fainting spells, and mobility issues among fashionable women, yet they were often reluctant to directly challenge prevailing fashion standards. Some progressive doctors began advocating for rational dress, though these ideas gained limited acceptance during the Victorian period itself. The psychological adaptation required to live within such constraints was considerable. Victorian women developed remarkable patience and planning skills, learning to anticipate their needs hours in advance and to endure discomfort with grace. The ability to maintain composure while managing significant physical limitations became a mark of true refinement and social accomplishment. This mental discipline extended beyond clothing to influence broader aspects of Victorian feminine behavior and social interaction. The international nature of Victorian society meant that women traveling abroad faced additional challenges in adapting to different climates and facilities, while maintaining appropriate dress standards. English ladies visiting the continent, American women touring Europe, and colonial wives managing household duties in tropical climates, all had to develop creative solutions for maintaining Victorian propriety under diverse conditions. The evolution of undergarments throughout the Victorian period reflected ongoing attempts to balance fashion, comfort, and practicality. The development of elastic materials, improved fastening systems, and more ergonomic designs represented gradual progress toward greater functionality. However, these improvements were often subtle and limited by the overriding importance placed on achieving the fashionable silhouette of the era. Children's literature of the period often included subtle instruction on proper deportment and dress management, though these lessons were typically embedded within stories about moral behavior and social propriety. Young girls learned through observation and gradual practice, with mothers and governesses providing discreet guidance on managing the practical aspects of increasingly elaborate dress. As children matured into society, the role of fashion magazines in disseminating information about proper dress and comportment cannot be overstated. Publications like Godey's Lady's Book provided not only style guidance but also subtle instruction on managing the practical aspects of fashionable attire. The advice columns and etiquette sections of these publications often contained coded language about addressing personal needs, while maintaining social propriety. The impact of climate on Victorian women's daily routines was significant and often underappreciated. Summer heat could make the layers of restrictive clothing nearly unbearable, while winter cold made access to outdoor facilities particularly challenging. The development of seasonal strategies for managing these difficulties required considerable forethought and planning, with many women adjusting their social schedules and daily routines according to weather conditions. The emergence of public facilities designed specifically for ladies represented a significant development in urban planning during the later Victorian period. Railway stations, department stores, and public buildings gradually incorporated ladies' retiring rooms, though these facilities were often inadequate for the complex requirements of managing elaborate dress. The design and maintenance of such spaces became a specialty within architecture and public health planning. The social dynamics of group outings and extended visits required careful coordination among Victorian women. Whether attending lengthy church services, elaborate dinner parties, or extended house parties, ladies had to communicate discreetly about their needs and coordinate their use of limited facilities. The development of social protocols around these necessities represented a sophisticated form of collective problem-solving among women of similar social standing. The transition periods in Victorian fashion, such as the shift from crinolines to bustles or the gradual acceptance of slightly less restrictive styles, created unique challenges as women adapted to new clothing technologies and social expectations. These changes were rarely sudden or complete, meaning that women often had to manage wardrobes containing garments representing different eras of fashion, each with its own specific requirements and challenges. The economic implications of maintaining Victorian feminine dress were substantial and often overlooked in discussions of the period. The cost of specialized undergarments, frequent cleaning and maintenance of delicate fabrics, and the employment of skilled servants to manage these requirements represented a significant portion of household budget. For middle-class families aspiring to maintain fashionable appearances, these expenses could create considerable financial strain. The development of travel clothing and specialized garments for different activities represented attempts to address some of the practical limitations of standard Victorian dress. Railway travel, seaside visits, and outdoor activities all spawned specialized clothing designed to maintain propriety while offering greater functionality. However, these adaptations were often limited and still required considerable skill to manage effectively. The role of mothers in preparing their daughters for the realities of adult feminine life included extensive training in the practical aspects of dress management. This education began early and continued throughout adolescence, with young women gradually taking on greater responsibility for managing their own clothing and personal needs. The mother-daughter transmission of knowledge about these intimate aspects of daily life represented an important but largely unrecorded form of women's cultural heritage. The impact of technological innovations like improved corset construction, better fabric treatments, and more sophisticated fastening systems gradually made Victorian dress somewhat more manageable, though it remained elaborate by any standard. The adoption of new materials and manufacturing techniques represented ongoing attempts to balance fashion requirements with practical functionality, though fashion considerations typically took precedent. The seasonal social calendar of Victorian society created periods of intense activity that required particularly careful planning and management. The London season, with its round of balls, garden parties, and social calls, demanded that ladies maintain their elaborate toilettes for extended periods while participating in a complex series of social obligations. The physical and logistical demands of such extended social activity required considerable stamina and organizational skill. The cultural variations within Victorian society meant that different social groups developed their own strategies for managing the challenges of fashionable dress. Rural gentry, urban merchant families, and aristocratic households all evolved slightly different approaches based on their specific circumstances and resources. These variations reflected broader patterns of regional and class-based adaptation within Victorian culture. The influence of Victorian dress constraints on women's participation in physical activities and outdoor pursuits was significant. The development of specialized sporting costumes for activities like croquet, tennis, and cycling represented attempts to maintain fashionable appearance while allowing for greater mobility. However, these adaptations were often limited and still required careful management and planning. The emergence of dress reform movements during the later Victorian period reflected growing awareness of the health and practical implications of restrictive clothing. Reformers advocated for more rational approaches to women's dress, though their proposals often met with resistance from conservative elements who viewed traditional feminine attire as essential to moral and social order. These debates highlighted the tension between practical needs and social expectations that characterized much of Victorian women's experience. The international exchange of fashion ideas and the influence of different cultural approaches to dress and propriety created a complex web of influences on Victorian women's daily experiences. French fashion, American practicality, and British propriety all contributed to evolving standards and practices. with individual women navigating these various influences according to their personal circumstances and social position. The role of servants in maintaining the complex lifestyle that Victorian feminine dress required extended beyond simple assistance with dressing and undressing. These employees often served as repositories of specialized knowledge about fabric care, fashion trends, and practical solutions to common problems. The relationship between mistress and servant in these intimate aspects of daily life often involved considerable trust and mutual dependence. The gradual changes in social attitudes toward privacy, modesty, and discussion of bodily functions during the Victorian period reflected broader cultural shifts that would eventually lead to more open approaches to these topics. However, during the Victorian era itself, the elaborate system of euphemisms, indirect communication, and discreet management of personal needs remained firmly entrenched in social protocol. The impact of urbanization on Victorian women's daily experiences created new challenges and opportunities for managing the practical aspects of fashionable dress. City living offered better access to shopping, services, and facilities, but also created new pressures for maintaining appropriate appearance in more crowded and public settings. The development of urban infrastructure gradually improved conditions for women navigating these challenges. The influence of literature and popular culture in shaping expectations about feminine behavior and dress management cannot be overlooked. Novels, etiquette books, and periodical literature all contributed to creating idealized standards of feminine deportment that women were expected to achieve despite the practical difficulties involved. These cultural productions both reflected and reinforced the complex system of expectations surrounding Victorian women's daily lives. The legacy of Victorian approaches to feminine dress and deportment continued to influence women's lives well into the 20th century, with many of the psychological and social patterns established during this period persisting long after the specific fashion constraints had disappeared. Understanding this historical period helps illuminate the complex relationship between social expectations, practical limitations, and individual adaptation that continues to characterize women's experiences in different forms today. The morning ritual of Victorian dress began before dawn in many households, with servants preparing the elaborate sequence of garments required for proper appearance. The lady's maid would warm the corset by the fire, ensuring that the metal stays and whalebone would not be shockingly cold against her mistress's skin. Each piece of clothing was carefully inspected for any damage or stains that might have occurred during previous wear, as the investment in such elaborate garments was substantial and their replacement expensive. The chemistry of Victorian perfumes and cosmetics played a crucial role in managing the intimate realities of restricted washing and elaborate dress. Rose water, lavender, and violet preparations masked the natural human odors that inevitably accumulated beneath layers of clothing that could not be easily removed or cleaned. The delicate balance between appearing naturally fresh and avoiding the social stigma of being thought to use too much artificial enhancement required considerable skill and discretion. Pregnancy presented particularly complex challenges for Victorian women committed to maintaining fashionable appearance throughout their confinement. Maternity corsets and adjustable dress designs allowed women to continue participating in social life for much of their pregnancy, though the combination of restrictive clothing and the physical changes of pregnancy created additional complications for managing personal hygiene and bodily functions. The discreet nature of these adaptations meant that many women navigated pregnancy challenges in relative isolation. The psychology of constraint became deeply ingrained in Victorian feminine identity, with many women reporting feeling exposed or improper when wearing less restrictive clothing. The gradual process of undressing each evening was often described in personal writings as both relief and vulnerability, as the removal of structural garments left women feeling physically and emotionally unprotected. This psychological dependence on restrictive clothing reflected the deep internalization of social expectations about feminine propriety. Elderly Victorian women faced particular challenges as their physical capabilities declined, while social expectations for proper dress remained unchanged. The assistance of daughters-in-law, or paid companions became essential for maintaining the elaborate toilette that social position demanded. The dignity of aging within such restrictive social conventions required both personal determination and considerable family or household support. The development of specialized furniture for ladies' dressing rooms reflected the unique spatial requirements created by Victorian feminine attire. Dressing tables with multiple mirrors, chairs designed for corseted figures, and wardrobes with careful organization systems for complex garments all represented adaptations to the practical needs of elaborate dress. The positioning of chamber pots, wash basins, and other necessities required careful consideration of movement patterns in full dress. The seasonal migration of wealthy families between country estates and London townhouses created additional logistics for managing the practical aspects of feminine dress. The transportation of elaborate wardrobes, specialized undergarments, and the servants skilled in their maintenance represented a substantial undertaking that required months of planning and coordination. The adaptation to different facilities and spatial arrangements in various residences added another layer of complexity to daily routines. The emergence of photography during the Victorian era created new pressures for maintaining perfect appearance, as any social gathering might result in a permanent record of one's dress and deport. The long exposure times required for early photography meant that ladies had to maintain their carefully arranged positions for extended periods, adding another dimension to the already complex task of managing elaborate dress with grace and dignity. Religious observance played a significant role in Victorian women's weekly routines, with Sunday services often requiring the most elaborate dress and longest periods of immobility. Church pews were gradually widened to accommodate fashionable skirts, and the architecture of new churches began to reflect the spatial requirements of contemporary feminine attire. The spiritual discipline of lengthy services in restrictive clothing was often viewed as appropriate feminine penance and devotion. The education of young women in proper dress management was considered as important as instruction in music, languages, or other accomplishments expected of ladies. Boarding schools employed specialist staff to teach the intricacies of corset lacing, crinoline management, and the discreet handling of personal necessities. The graduating requirements often included demonstrations of proper deportment in full dress, ensuring that young women entered society fully prepared for its demands. The international marriage market of Victorian high society created situations where young women had to adapt their dress management skills to different cultural expectations and climatic conditions. English ladies marrying into continental European families, American heiresses entering British aristocratic circles, and colonial daughters visiting metropolitan centers all faced the challenge of maintaining Victorian propriety while adapting to new environments and expectations. The role of illness in disrupting the careful routines of Victorian feminine life created particular challenges for maintaining modesty and propriety during periods of physical weakness. Special sickroom attire and modified undergarments allowed for easier care while preserving appropriate appearance, though serious illness often required temporary abandonment of fashionable dress in favor of practical nursing consideration. The development of specialized cleaning methods for elaborate Victorian garments reflected the considerable investment these items represented. Professional dress cleaners emerged as skilled artisans who understood the complex requirements of maintaining silk, velvet, lace, and metallic trimmings. The seasonal cleaning and storage of elaborate wardrobes became a major household undertaking requiring specialized knowledge and considerable time. The influence of mourning dress traditions on Victorian women's daily routines created additional complications for managing practical needs while observing appropriate grief protocols. Mourning attire was often even more elaborate and restrictive than regular dress, yet had to be worn for extended periods during which social activities were limited. The gradual transition through different stages of mourning dress required careful attention to both fashion and social propriety. The emergence of women's clubs and professional organizations during the later Victorian period created new contexts where ladies had to manage the practical aspects of dress while participating in extended meetings and activity. The development of more functional day dress for professional women began to challenge traditional assumptions about feminine propriety, though these changes remained limited and often controversial. The impact of economic downturns on middle-class Victorian families often meant that women had to maintain fashionable appearances with reduced household staff and resources. The skills required to manage elaborate dress independently, maintain complex garments without professional help, and preserve social status despite reduced circumstances required considerable ingenuity and determination. The role of gossip and social observation in Victorian society meant that any failure in dress management or personal propriety would be quickly noted and discussed. The pressure to maintain perfect appearance at all times created constant vigilance and anxiety among women conscious of their social position. The development of strategies for discreet problem-solving and damage control became essential survival skills in Victorian social environment. The gradual introduction of gas lighting and later electric lighting in Victorian homes changed the dynamics of evening routines and dress management. Better illumination made possible more elaborate evening toilettes, but also increased the visibility of any imperfections in dress or deportment. The interplay between improving technology and evolving social expectations created new challenges and opportunities for Victorian women. The development of specialized undergarments for different activities and seasons reflected ongoing attempts to balance fashionable appearance with practical function. Summer corsets made of lighter materials, travel stays designed for comfort during long journeys, and evening wear with different structural requirements, all represented adaptations to specific circumstances, while maintaining overall adherence to fashionable silhouette. The influence of artistic and aesthetic movements on Victorian dress began to introduce alternative approaches to feminine attire during the later decades of the century. The pre-Raphaelite preference for flowing, less structured garments, and the aesthetic movement's emphasis on beauty over conventional propriety offered new models for feminine dress, though these alternatives remained limited to specific artistic and intellectual circles. The role of personal letters and diaries in documenting the private experiences of Victorian women provides invaluable insight into the daily realities behind public appearance. These intimate records reveal the physical discomfort, practical frustrations, and creative solutions that characterized women's relationships with their elaborate dress, offering perspectives rarely visible in public discourse of the era. The impact of technological innovations like the sewing machine, improved fabric production, and mass manufacturing techniques gradually made fashionable dress more accessible while creating new expectations for variety and elaboration. The democratization of fashion created new social pressures as more women could afford to participate in fashionable dress, though the most elaborate styles remained markers of higher social status. The development of specialized medical treatment for conditions related to restrictive dress reflected growing awareness of health implications while maintaining social acceptance of fashionable attire. Treatments for digestive problems, back pain, and circulation issues became common among fashionable women, though the connection to dress restrictions was often minimized or denied in polite society. The influence of climate and geography on the adaptation of Victorian dress created regional variations in how women managed the practical challenges of elaborate attire. Southern American ladies dealing with heat and humidity, Canadian women managing extreme cold, and tropical colonial wives adapting to entirely different climatic conditions all developed specialized strategies while maintaining recognizably Victorian feminine appearance. The role of charitable and reform activities in Victorian women's lives created new contexts where practical dress management intersected with social purpose. Ladies visiting the poor, participating in reform organizations, or engaging in philanthropic work had to balance fashionable appearance with the practical demands of their charitable activities, leading to the gradual development of more functional day dress for active women. The emergence of new forms of entertainment and social activities during the Victorian period created fresh challenges for dress management. The popularity of croquet, tennis, cycling, and other outdoor pursuits required specialized costumes that maintained propriety while allowing for increased physical activity. The development of these specialized garments represented ongoing negotiations between social expectations and practical requirements. The International Exposition and World's Fair phenomena of the Victorian era brought together women from different cultures and fashion traditions, creating opportunities for observing alternative approaches to feminine dress and deportment. These cultural exchanges gradually influenced Victorian attitudes toward clothing and contributed to the slow evolution of more practical approaches to feminine attire. The role of economic prosperity in enabling elaborate Victorian feminine dress created social pressures that extended throughout the middle classes. The ability to maintain fashionable appearance became a crucial marker of family social status, creating financial strain for many households committed to maintaining appropriate appearances regardless of their actual economic circumstances. The development of urban transportation systems during the Victorian era created new challenges and opportunities for women managing elaborate dress in public spaces. Omnibuses, trams, and later underground railways all required adaptations and dress management techniques, while also making possible greater mobility and social participation for women willing to navigate these challenges. The influence of military conflicts and national events on Victorian society created periods when normal social routines were disrupted, requiring adaptations in dress and deportment expectations. The Crimean War, various colonial conflicts, and periods of national mourning all influenced women's dress and daily routines, demonstrating the interconnection between personal and political spheres in Victorian life. The role of domestic architecture in supporting Victorian feminine lifestyle extended beyond simple spatial considerations to include ventilation, lighting, and sanitation systems that made elaborate dress more manageable. The development of modern plumbing, improved heating systems, and better household organization all contributed to making the practical aspects of Victorian feminine life somewhat more comfortable. The emergence of early feminist thought during the Victorian period began to question the relationship between elaborate dress and women's social and political status. Writers and activists argued that restrictive clothing symbolized broader restrictions on women's autonomy and capabilities, though these critiques gained limited acceptance during the Victorian era itself and faced considerable social resistance. The gradual changes in Victorian children's dress throughout the period reflected evolving understanding of child development and health while maintaining adherence to social expectations about appropriate appearance. The transition from elaborate miniature adult costume to more practical children's wear represented one of the earliest successful challenges to purely fashion-driven approaches to dress. The role of seasonal social activities in structuring Victorian women's lives created predictable patterns of intensive dress management, alternating with periods of relative relaxation. The London season summer house parties, winter balls, and spring garden parties all required different approaches to managing elaborate dress while participating in extended social activity. As we drift toward the close of this gentle historical journey, we can appreciate the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of Victorian women who navigated these daily challenges with grace and dignity. Their stories remind us that human adaptability knows no bounds, and that even the most restrictive social conventions cannot completely constrain the human spirit's capacity for practical problem-solving and quiet resistance. In the soft rustle of silk and the careful management of elaborate dress, we hear the whispered stories of countless women who found ways to live fully human lives within the constraints of their era, leaving us a legacy of patience, ingenuity, and enduring strength that continues to inspire us as we face our own daily challenges in our own unique historical moment.